Happy Pride, by the way. Umbrella. A rainbow octopus. Umbrella octopus. That's not... I guess he could be. Rainbow octopus's umbrella. Thanks, weird anomia that just substituted umbrella for rainbow. What the heck? Let's get into what regulation is. Let's go! Hello and welcome to the Trauma-Informed SLP. I am Kim Neely. I am a late diagnosed, multiply neurodivergent. I'm also a trained speech language pathologist here in the United States, and I've had additional training on trauma-informed care, and it's really helped me to understand a lot of just humans and why we fight with each other and stuff. So I'm here on YouTube just trying to help unpack things for myself and maybe for other people, and just to promote more compassion and understanding and healing and all that stuff. So welcome. And this is the technically second video in my Neurodivergent 101 series, or welcome to your late diagnosis essentially series. I think that might be what I called it under the playlists, but nonetheless, it's just something I'm putting out here with my speech pathology knowledge and my trauma-informed knowledge, and also my own experience of kind of therapizing myself with my late diagnosis and starting to understand myself better. I said that weird. And yeah, so I decided to do this because it's helpful for clinicians to know. It's helpful for teachers, anybody who works with any kind of neurodivergent. So this is technically the second video as far as I'm recording. I did sensory profiles first, and then I realized later on that I probably should have started with regulation. Honestly, this is probably the biggest topic that comes up the very most, even when it comes to sensory sensitivities and stuff, is regulation and what the heck people mean when they talk about self-regulation or co-regulation or whatever, right? Help with regulation. What are people talking about? What is that essentially shorthand for? So that's what this episode is about. Welcome. And I hope you find this helpful. If you do, drop a comment below or hit the thumbs up. I'm really bad at self-promotion, but this is my little attempt at trying to say, hey, let me get to at least 100 subscribers. I'm a little babby YouTube channel here, but it would be lovely to get some more subscribers given my hyperfixations and the way that I branch off into so many different things I'm doing. I'm really bad at posting very consistently, which makes the algorithm very not happy. So thumbs up, comments, sharing it around, that stuff all helps. Subscribing, that stuff all helps. Tell the algorithm, hey, yeah, it's worth telling other people about this weirdo over here on the internet. And I use weirdo affectionately. I'm reclaiming it for myself. So what is regulation? Especially in the neurodivergent world, in the medical world in general, for people who have disabilities and stuff, they can talk about regulation a lot. So what are they talking about? Body regulation refers to your ability to manage and control all the various physiological functions and processes we use to just go throughout our day, to function, okay? And to maintain some level of health and balance, all right? So it's pretty much all handled by the autonomic nervous system. And it is what it sounds like. It's the automatic system. So it's the one that's in charge of all the automatic things, the things you don't have to think about that hard in order to regulate, right? So we do have physical regulation in terms of being able to regulate your body temperature, right? Not getting too hot, not getting too cold, sweating when you're hot to cool yourself off, or shivering when you're cold to try to warm yourself up. That's part of temperature regulation. We have heart rate regulation, breathing when it comes to oxygen levels in our blood and such. We have our hunger and our thirst cues and our needing to go to the toilet cues, right? That's all part of regulation. And we have sleep-wake cycles. So that's physical regulation. And these things can definitely be impacted by neurodevelopmental differences, like neurodivergencies in the developmental sense, and also by things like traumatic brain injuries, okay? Especially in the acute stage. When I worked with acute brain injury patients, they were usually on medication to help their body regain regulation of things like blood pressure and stuff, right? So they could stand up. If they did have full mobility, they could stand up without fainting, for example. So it can be definitely something that's impacted by a variety of different neurological things and medical things. But I think the bigger piece of body regulation that most people are talking about online, on social media, when they talk about regulation or tips on regulation or co-regulation or how to self-regulate, most of the time they're talking about the emotional and nervous system regulation. So it's that emotional, that mind-body connection when it comes to our emotions and our stress and how we handle it. That's often what people are talking about. And this is a really big deal in trauma literature. It's very big and very much studied with people who are diagnosed with PTSD, because this type of regulation, this nervous system, emotional regulation, this mind-body connection is what really gets out of place during trauma. That's like one of the hallmarks of a traumatic response, is you have this dysregulated nervous system in your body that doesn't really allow for very effective emotional processing, for example, or very effective or like healthy ways of dealing with emotion, right? So it's a big deal there. It's also definitely a big deal when it comes to autism, ADHD, all the other neurodivergencies out there, because neurodivergent is not a synonym for autism. It's an umbrella term. So, you know, people who might have some sort of genetic syndrome, people just with heightened sensory sensitivities, that can really impact their nervous system regulation by just causing a lot of stress, essentially, on that autonomic system. Okay. So it's a really big deal that a lot of people talk about because it affects a lot of us. Okay. And quite frankly, there's a lot of neurodivergence, especially late diagnosed neurodivergence, who, when it comes to trauma literature stuff, whether or not you're diagnosed with some kind of PTSD, a lot of us have some level of trauma responses in our body just due to ignoring our actual needs, or maybe having our accommodations denied, or, you know, being kind of chronically shamed for being like lazy or whatever, right? We get these like societal messages that can really impact the way we see ourselves and our own self-value, but it also causes a lot of stress, because a lot of those things really make us feel very emotionally and psychologically unsafe, and perhaps even physically unsafe if people are denying us bodily autonomy. And especially for people with more significant medical needs, like their bodily autonomy they effectively don't have it because they get like moved around so much. But yes, a lot of us non-speakers, they'll have that experience of bodily autonomy being violated and never even be given the chance to like protest, or having their protests completely ignored, especially if their protests involve like biting or scratching or kicking, right? Like that gets completely ignored. So yeah, definitely a problem. So trauma experiences wise, a lot of neurodivergence, whether late diagnosed or not, we get a lot of cues from society that we're not completely safe. And so that constant feeling of not being very safe around people definitely increases our sympathetic response, which is what I'm going to get to, the fight, flight, freeze response. Okay. So when we're talking about emotional and nervous system regulation, this mind-body connection, that's what it is, okay? It's the autonomic system. It's how it talks to the emotional centers in our brain, particularly the midbrain areas like our amygdala, our hippocampus, our hypothalamus, those guys kind of in this area of the brain. Sorry, I need to put down my little dude, kind of right here, right? When we're talking to those guys, the autonomic system talks directly to those guys and gets orders essentially from those guys in our brain. And then all the stuff that happens at that level of the brain we're not aware of. We're not aware until all that information actually goes further up into our anterior cingulate cortex and other like prefrontal cortices. This is where we're actually aware, okay, of things happening. So let's talk a little bit about how the autonomic system works when it comes to our body's nervous system regulation. In our peripheral nervous system, meaning not our brain and not our spinal cord, we're talking about our like torso and our limbs, okay? We have like kind of our voluntary nervous system, like I'm moving my fingers, this is a voluntary muscles, right? That kind of thing. And we have all the functions that happen automatically, like I just said, all the physical regulation pieces and stuff. The autonomic system is the one that has two branches, okay? This is the one that has the sympathetic branch, known as the fight, flight, freeze branch, which really what it actually does is increases energy to like your voluntary movement, essentially. And it increases your heart rate and all this stuff. It turns down digestion and it gets your body ready to like either fight a bear or run or whatever. But it also kicks in when you're excited, okay? Like when you're on a roller coaster, right? Or when people do like extreme sports, like they're still activating their sympathetic system, okay? That's still, it really jazzes us up, you know, increases our energy, right? That's what it does on the output. And when it sends information to the brain, what it's sending is information about things that are changing. Like our heart rate is increasing. It's letting the brain know heart rate is increasing. It'll let the brain know you stubbed your toe and there's sudden pain there. That's coming up through that system so that your midbrain knows, your amygdala knows that things are changing. The balance of this is the parasympathetic or the rest and digest system. So this one is the one that lowers the energy level for most of your body, except for your digestion system, because to digest food takes a fair amount of energy, you know, so it's best to do when we're not running from a bear, right? Better to just like be able to chill and digest our food. So that's why that goes up and everything else kind of gets dialed down. So, you know, it lowers your heart rate and conserves the overall energy in terms of like your voluntary muscle groups. Okay. And when it's sending information up to your amygdala, it's sending just like current state of like, here's our base state of what's going on right now. It's like, here's where our blood pressure is at. Here's where the blood sugar is at. Here's what we've digested, right? Here's the nutrition we've gotten. Here's the amount of sugar we've stored, the amount of like calories, energy, basically we've stored into our system from food and stuff like that. That's what's going up through parasympathetic. Quick side note and tangent for those who are interested in etymology or the origin of words. I got very curious as to why it's called the sympathetic system when it's fight, flight, freeze. I was like, why is it sympathetic? That doesn't sound like all sympathetic. It doesn't make you more sympathetic toward others. It actually does the opposite when you're in that mode. And so I looked it up because that's what it do. And it actually is called sympathetic it's from the same root word as symphony, right? So it's actually sympathetic in the sense that it all works together. Like it coordinates things and makes it work together as a unit. That's what the sympathetic means in this context. It's not like the emotional context of sympathy or compassion. It's not that. It's making all of these different physiological units work together in conjunction. And parasympathetic, I think it's called para because it's like arresting the sympathetic system. It's the balance. It's the counterbalance, basically. It's the one that pulls the reins on all that energy usage. You can kind of think of them as almost like your tricep and your bicep in your arm, right? Like the bicep curls this way, the tricep moves your arm that way. So it's like, it's that balance between the two that gives you the ideal movement or the ideal like function, right? So that is actually what well-regulated means. Like a healthy autonomic system, a healthy nervous system regulation means that your body can be really responsive to whatever environmental needs appear and whatever you need to do at that moment in time, right? It means if you need a little more energy, if you're about to go on that roller coaster, it's going to increase your sympathetic, right? Your sympathetic gets turned on a little bit more and parasympathetic turns down a little more because you don't want to be digesting while you're on the roller coaster, you know? This is also why I don't eat those funnel cakes until you get off the rides and take a little break and digest that first. This is why a lot of those certain accidents tend to happen at like carnivals and amusement parks because people don't do that. And then they might feel a certain way. Little digestive accidents might happen, especially with kids. So that's what well-regulated means though, right? And if you go home from the amusement park and you just want to chill out and rest, then your parasympathetic kicks on and helps you to relax, right? So well-regulated means it's very responsive. Just like my arm, if I need to pick something up and I need to put it back down, my bicep and my tricep and bicep tend to be responsive to that, right? My brain can say like, lift this thing and now put it back down and my arm responds. That's not true for people who have spastic type muscle conditions where they don't get the amount of relaxation. So that would be like an off balance system there, right? So similarly, if we have an off balanced autonomic system, if our sympathetic is too active and too reactive, like it's too easy to turn on and it stays on for a really long time, then we don't get the right amount of balance and we don't get that rest and recovery from sympathetic coming back on, right? And we're not as responsive to being able to like say, oh, I'm going into a lecture, I need to calm myself down, maybe fidget to help myself focus, but I've got to do some things to help my body focus here because that's the energy level I need is sitting and focusing on what's being said, right? Versus being on a roller coaster or like, you know, running from a bear or whatever, which don't run from bears. I don't think there's a single bear type where they say run. No, because black bears, it's like you get bigger. Grizzly bears, you're supposed to get as small as you possibly can, roll into a little ball, protect yourself because grizzly bears are aggressive. They'll fight you. And black bears typically run away if you get really big and like you look really scary and sound scary. And then like polar bears is like just say bye, apparently. Like there's polar bears are very aggressive and huge. So when we're dysregulated, typically 9 times out of 10, when people talk about dysregulation, especially in today's world, what they're talking about is too much sympathetic activation, high fight, flight, freeze responses, where you can go really high, really fast and stay there for a lot longer. And it can be really hard to calm down. This is an issue for like people with developmental things like autism, ADHD, that stuff. But it can also be an issue for people who are just like super burnt out. People who are like crazy burnt out from work or under a ton of chronic stress, they can develop this dysregulation as well. And also, yes, trauma victims, definitely. There's actually a study by Quinones et al., which I checked, it's not Ñoñez, it's Quinones et al. I'll put it up on the screen here, but they talk about how a hyperactive sympathetic system, it's been found to both turn on faster and stay on longer in people with diagnosed PTSD. And they say that's essentially the hallmark. You could honestly say, physiologically speaking, that is the one main key symptom of a trauma response is that heightened sympathetic response. And it's hard to get it to calm back down. So what ends up happening basically is your sympathetic system can get so overreactive that the parasympathetic is actually a little sluggish to come back on. It doesn't have the right balance, right? It's almost like if I'm really good at contracting my bicep, but I can't get the tricep to react and the bicep to relax, then I can't release the object I'm carrying, right? It's just out of balance to the point where it's very hard to turn on the resting and the digesting. And this is where you get into things like when people have chronic digestive issues, when we talk about chronic stress and we talk about the effect of trauma and chronic stress on the body and how digestive issues can be a big hallmark of that. This is how we get into that, like it's carried in the body kind of idea, right? Because if you don't have enough parasympathetic system turning on, your digestion's not going to go as well. Because that one is in charge of ramping up your digestion and having it go really well. And the sympathetic system doesn't do that. It shuts down the digestive system, right? So in mental health circles, and I'll put up some images for this. In mental health circles, they talk about something called the window of tolerance. This is a really big visual model they use to talk about this nervous system and emotional regulation and how they relate to each other. So when you have that nice balance of parasympathetic and sympathetic activation throughout your day, your emotions that relate to those will ebb and flow, right? You can have some excitement and some increased sympathetic, and then you're going to have some relaxation and start to calm down a little bit more, right? That's that nice, healthy, the emotions come and go. Like that's what emotions should do. Emotions should be like waves on the water. They're not like the current. They're like the waves, right? They're the surface, right? What's happening there. And the regulation is more like the actual current, like the ocean currents or the current in the river, right? Regulation is more what's going on over a longer period of time. Does that make sense? And when people are dysregulated, it's called a narrowing of the window of tolerance, meaning you become more intolerant to shifts in your emotional state because it shifts your autonomic state. And what it typically does when you're dysregulated, typically for most people, when we're talking about it, especially out on social media, it's shifting into sympathetic. And that's why it's a little like your reactions are bigger. Your emotions can be really big, right? You might suddenly go into like really angry or really frustrated, or you might feel really anxious or really panicky, right? You might not be able to sleep. Your thoughts might be racing. You might have pain. You might have like headaches and stuff that develop from that, or stomach pain, right? And then The thing about high sympathetic activation is you do have a finite amount of energy that can be given to the sympathetic system, okay? Our body has ways of pushing us through, like it can increase cortisol and keep us in that state for longer than it wants to. Hence, chronic stress and cortisol release is like not great on our health, okay? Cortisol is a fine hormone if it's in smaller doses, but if it's sustained, it's tough. But it helps us to sustain our sympathetic response, right? And when we say we need to do that, like if we're chronically stressed at work and we're pushing through this really stressful, like high exhaustion, high burnout time, yeah, our body will keep us in sympathetic response longer than it should, right? But if we stay there long enough, or if we're having a traumatic response to a single event or something like a PTSD type response, what we end up with is now we've stayed in sympathetic response for so long that our parasympathetic can't really kick back in and relax us. So a lot of times when people are stuck in this dysregulated state, they do experience these energy crashes, right? They get really they might feel kind of emotionally numb. They might feel kind of depressed. They might get kind of shut down or withdrawn, maybe feel kind of empty, right? Like they just feel like just completely burnt, right? Like the candle is just burnt out, right? You burned it at both ends and now you don't have a candle anymore. And if somebody is chronically dysregulated, that crash is likely due to just depleting your energy stores. Like energy in our body, our physiological energy, it's molecular, it's cellular, molecular, it's microscopic, but it is still, they are still physical things. They're still physical molecules our body is using as energy. And so at some point, that's going to burn out. Okay. At some point, your body has to replenish those stores. It has to, produce more of those molecules and stuff, right? So our body has to force us to rest at some point. So sometimes it's not even necessarily parasympathetic that's kicking back in the rest. It literally is just like, well, we're burnt out now. We have nothing left to give. We're going to crash. Find a place to crash because that's what we got to do now, right? So just so you know, you could have that still kind of sympathetic dominant, but it's hypoarousal, meaning you can't drum up any more energy because you're just out. The tank is empty. You got to wait for it to refill. So that is what kind of that chronic dysregulation can feel like. It's that constant up, down. And it can feel like emotions don't subside. It feels like emotions don't come and go. It feels like emotions are more chronic states of being until you crash from that emotion. That's also kind of a sign of emotional dysregulation, okay? I'm hoping I'm not wiggling things, but I just tapped I have a lamp off to the side and I just tapped it with my hand by doing this gesture while I'm talking. And that chronic stress piece of dysregulation, like I said, it could be related to too much cortisol in your body. And it can be the impact of a lot of different things for us when it comes to chronic stress in our environment. It can be the impact of, going outside in the city is too noisy. The world is too bright. Those restaurants are too loud. Those colors are obnoxious. The blinking lights at Christmas are too much, right? For people with sensory sensitivities, right? Smells can be too much. Tastes can be too much, especially, and that can be a real problem for kids who have high sensitivity to taste and smell, can create issues with getting adequate nutrition, actually being willing to eat enough diverse foods that you get the right amount of nutrition for adequate growth and brain development and stuff, right? So it can definitely be a concern in that area of pediatric feeding stuff. It can also be the impact of sleep deprivation for new parents or for parents who have kids with high medical needs, right? That is a chronically stressful situation, right? And they're chronically pushing through a lot of burnout and a lot of exhaustion because no one else is going to do the caregiving if they don't, right? Especially in the United States system where we don't offer adequate supports. We really need to support parents a lot better. And also, like I said, particularly to late diagnosed neurodivergence, it can be that cumulative effect of, microaggressions and sort of that systemic internalized ableism, things around being lazy or not being capable of doing basic things or being incompetent or just, not having enough willpower or whatever these messages we get, we can internalize the sense of shame and our amygdala is not going to feel super safe in that kind of environment and with those kind of messages. And it can definitely lead more to this dysregulated, I'm hypervigilant against, being unsafe here, and you learn to mask, you do all that sort of stuff, right? So that, I think, is why dysregulation becomes a really big topic amongst the neurodivergent community, but also amongst like mental health circles and people with mental illnesses and, people under a lot of chronic stress and things like that. It's a big topic these days because it is something we tend to struggle with. And especially in the United States and the broader United States, like middle class, suburban type, more centralized culture that exists in this country, we are not taught anything to help us regulate. We are not taught traditions to help us really do that. We get told about self-care later on as adults. And then we're told that self-care only looks like one certain thing, right? Instead of it being like a way to get your rest and digest more active, right? Which is really what it should be, So I think that's why a lot of dysregulation is happening. And I think, honestly, also coming off of COVID shutdown, I think a lot of people had a lot of issues with regulating during COVID shutdown, especially if socializing was their main way of keeping themselves a little more balanced and healthy and regulated. And then they lost access to that. It's big issues there, right? So I think personally, my personal opinion, we live in a highly dysregulated world. A lot of people are walking around very dysregulated and having a lot of mental health struggles in relation to that and looking for the cause of why they feel the way they feel instead of necessarily seeking the guidance and the help they might need from, say, a trained mental health professional, for example, right? Okay. I also want to note just a little pet peeve that honestly I'm trying to train myself out of, which is a lot of times these days, especially on social media, a lot of people use dysregulated as a synonym for emotionally upset. And those two things are not the same, okay? Dysregulated people do tend to have really big emotional reactions, right? And like I said, those reactions can last a lot longer. They can hang on for a really long time because of the dominance of that fight, flight, freeze system, right? But it doesn't mean the same thing as if you can be a well-regulated person and still experience emotional upset, okay? You could have the appropriate balance of the emotions can come and go, but you can still feel what I like to call uncomfortable emotions, because to me, they're physically uncomfortable. Things like anger and sadness and fear and disgust, those kind of emotions and emotions related to those emotions, right? They are very important aspects of our experience. They're important parts of our brain telling us about potential dangers or perhaps misplaced trust, somebody violated a boundary, whatever it may be. It's telling us messages, and it's important to honor those. Those aren't bad emotions. They're not negative. That's why I don't like saying they're negative. I like saying they're uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to feel them. I don't like feeling them, and I want them to pass as quickly as possible. But it's important to process those if you are able to process them and let them wane. If you're too dysregulated, it might be hard. Prior to getting treatment for my anxiety, and quite frankly, getting medication to help with anxiety and depression, I don't think I would have been able to really process things like anger and sadness and fear easily. I needed help doing that. I needed professional guidance, and I needed medication actually ultimately to really help me learn how to process those kind of emotions. And I still struggle with it because they are very dysregulating to me, because sensory wise, I hate the experience of those emotions. It's something I've recently learned about myself, is that I will avoid feeling those emotions for too long because they're uncomfortable and because it's a sensory overload for me. If I'm really feeling very angry for too long, it's if I go too deep into that anger, I'm sensory overload with that. And so I have to learn how to process in small pieces instead of letting it go so long that it becomes more of a straight up overload. It's one thing I'm currently working on. But yeah, I think oftentimes, colloquially speaking, especially on social media, when people talk about trauma and when they talk about their own experiences and stuff, they're conflating dysregulated with emotional upset and feeling angry, especially, particularly angry. But if you're just feeling angry or you're just feeling fearful, right? Those things can emotions that you still feel even if you're actually regulated and balanced. And I think it's something good to know about if you are in the process of healing and you're starting to heal from your dysregulation and you're starting to feel yeah, I could actually, process some emotions and let them come and go. I'm trying to learn to just say I am upset. I'm not dysregulated. I'm upset right now. Right. And that I still do get dysregulated. I still do get meltdowns, but I'm trying personally to distinguish between like when I have a healthy level of emotional upset for a certain situation versus being dysregulated, because I think it is important for individuals, for us as individuals, to learn to distinguish that. I think it might be an important part, or at least for me anyway, seems to be kind of an important part of my healing, is accepting like sometimes anger is justified and it's okay to feel that way, right? Like if I feel like somebody is being really sexist or really ableist toward me, right? If they're being willfully mean toward me due to something they've judged about me, like that can make me angry or it can make me really sad. And like that's justified. That's a justified reaction to something like that. You know what I mean? So that's just a side note that they're not actually the same thing, but they can feel like the same thing when you're actually dysregulated. Emotional upset and dysregulation feels like the exact same thing. But that's not necessarily the case. Dysregulation just means the energy level that emotion is bringing up in you is not necessarily what is really demanded in that particular situation, right? You might have a higher reaction than the situation actually needs, right? With that said, I just want to say that healing your dysregulation, if you're on the journey of trying to balance and trying to regulate a little bit more, right, it takes a long time. You have to allow the physiological shifts to happen. So it's developing a habit and then it's like continuing that habit, and it does get easier with time. Personally, I think the best place to start is with increasing your awareness for what stress feels like in your body. Right? So if you are in a sensory environment that's really stressful, how do you feel that in your body? Right? What does it feel like when you're pushing past when you want to rest? If you're ignoring your rest cues, what does it feel like in your body when you do that? Do you feel fluttery tummy? Do you start getting a headache? Do you feel like your chest is tight? Is it hard to take a deep breath? Is it hard to slow down? Right? Are you fidgety in the sense of like you're uncomfortable just sitting because you gotta go somewhere, right? Like you have something to do, right? Like you're really anxious about it, you know? That's stuff to start noticing. And then you can learn to develop like strategies and techniques that help to activate your rest and digest system, which I'm going to go through like kind of what I think of in terms of like the 3 kind of categories of what these exercises tend to look like. But I do want to say it is kind of hard at first, and you kind of have to figure out what works for you. And when you're really out of balance, it can be really hard to feel rest and digest. It can be very hard to actually feel rested, like peaceful, calm. That might feel like a foreign thing, right? But the more you do strategies and techniques and exercises to help engage that, the easier it does get, right? The more responsive the parasympathetic system gets. So that's going to be the final section here. We're going to go through kind of how I personally categorize regulation exercises that you might encounter out there and all the different flavors of them. There is a ton out there on regulation in terms of body regulation. You might see it as bottom-up emotional processing as well. So it's where you're activating that rest and digest system. That's bottom-up processing. You are processing emotions. You're just doing it through your body instead of conscious awareness of like your identity and your sense of self and stuff. You're not bothering with all of that. You're just doing calming the body stuff, right? Which is not the only piece you need to really heal if you have significant mental health impacts from like trauma or from chronic shaming or something like that. Like, do seek out a mental health professional to really help you unpack your own individual experiences. But it's still a good place to start, and it's a place everybody can start. It's just learning how to calm our bodies a little more and get that parasympathetic more active, right? And help it to balance. If you feel like your fight-flight system is a little too hyper, all too easy to get engaged, you got to try to help balance it by getting the parasympathetic a little stronger, right? One type that you see a lot are what I call kind of your mindfulness types, right? When people talk about mindfulness as being a good thing to do. These ones are ones where it's like you're going to use your conscious brain to call attention away from anything that's causing you a lot of stress or anxiety or fear or anger or something. You're kind of like calling on your attention centers to pay attention to something else, so that actually can kick in your parasympathetic, because it's moving that fight, flight, freeze response away from the threat. It's like, we're actually not under threat. Look, if you logically look at the situation, we're not actually under a lot of threat right now, so we can actually relax. Is kind of what mindfulness is doing, essentially. So these are the type of ones where it's like the grounding techniques, like the, think of, 5 things you currently can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, whatever, things you can touch, like things like that, right? You bring awareness to your body and you're in the environment. Like you get aware of your present self, right? In the current environment that you're in. And also like anytime somebody has like a mindfulness kind of mantra or any type of like guided meditation stuff, tends to be more of a mindfulness type of kicking in that parasympathetic system, okay? Then you have deep breathing type of ones, which a lot of them do incorporate. Mindfulness ones will also often incorporate deep breathing because slowing down your breath and taking really deep, nourishing breaths, essentially, those really deep, low breaths in your body, that helps to kick on your parasympathetic system just through like the balance of like oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood and like slowing down your heart rate. Like it's calling upon the parasympathetic to slow your heart rate because you're slowing your breathing consciously. And we have a lot more conscious control over our breathing than we do our heart rate. We tend to control our heart rate through our breathing. So that's how that works. You're like consciously controlling your breathing, and then that kicks in the parasympathetic to go, oh yeah, we could slow down our heart rate because we're getting a lot of oxygen in with these big breaths. It can help slow it down. So this is the one where you could just be taking slow, deep breaths. There's ones where you're breathing in on a count, breathe in on 4, hold it for 4, release for 4. Like that's a deep breathing plus mindfulness because it's also bringing your awareness a little deeper into the counting. A lot of deep breathing ones also add in those sensory components. So things like tapping, right? There's a popular one there that brings in that like extra mindfulness towards your body. Like you're becoming more aware of a sensation in your body by doing the tapping. There's also ones where you can trace your fingers and breathe, right? Or you can trace shapes on your hands and breathe. And, like you take a circle, you breathe in around one and then you exhale when you go back around again, like that kind of deep breathing type of ones. That's all part of that. You're kicking in the parasympathetic with the deep breaths. And if you add in the sensory stuff and that kind of awareness and the counting, you're actually adding in the mindfulness as well. You're kind of overlaying those. Okay. And then there's a regulation that I call these like the burning up the energy ones. So these are ones where like, if you are feeling really anxious or feeling really stressed, and it's too hard to do the mindfulness and the deep breathing, like it feels awful and it makes you more anxious because it can, right? There can be situations where trying to do the deep breath type of ones and the mindfulness type of ones like is too much and like, no, it's making your brain more stressed. And if that's the case, you can try one of these like burning up the energy ones. Okay. So these are ones like the one that I personally don't like, but I have friends who love it. So I'll mention it, but that's an example of it's, different strokes for different folks. We have different things that we like. But the body scan one where like you think about, like contract your calves and your feet really, really, really hard and hold it for like 5 seconds and then release all the muscles. And then go up to your thighs and contract your thighs really, really, really tight for 5 seconds and then release them. I personally hate how it feels to just maximally contract my muscles out of nowhere. I don't like the feeling. So I don't like this one. But I think the idea behind that one is you're like burning up some of that adrenaline you might have, right? You're kind of burning through that that extra energy that your muscles have been given and then kind of releasing it a bit. And then one thing I used to do a lot, especially with like preschoolers and stuff, is to do like a short burst of like some kind of high intensity exercise, like 20 jumping jacks really fast, really, really high jumps, really big, really fast jumping jacks, right? Or you could do like the running in place with the really high knees, you know what I mean? Or any kind of hopping, bouncing. It could even just be like crazy wild dancing or wiggling or something, right? And depending, if you're an adult who has just a whole lot of anxiety, this is part of like exercise usually helps with like anxiety and stuff, is that you're burning through that adrenaline, but in a healthy way. You're burning through those energy stores that all that sympathetic response has given you, but it's doing it kind of through that healthy contracting of muscles and exercising. You're basically doing what fight, flight, freeze wants you to do, right? You're using those muscles the way that that system wants you to use them, and then it can help with relaxing. So yeah, if you have really high anxiety or you're just under a whole lot of stress, it might be easier for you to do like do a big workout, do like some high intensity thing to really burn through all that energy, and then maybe try like mindfulness or the deep breath type of ones, right? Find something there you might like after you do the really hard workout. Like honestly, even pre like mental health treatment for me, yoga class, like high intensity yoga classes was usually really awesome for me because I think it allowed me to burn up all my energy. If it was like high intensity, I burned through a lot of muscle energy, but then yoga always ends with like that shavasana, right? That like corpse pose, the resting, like you're just laying there and resting for a while. And that was like one of the few times prior to like medication and treatment for anxiety, that shavasana at the end of a really intense class was always so rejuvenating to me because I think it's one of the few times I could feel really relaxed because I burned up a lot of my energy. I think it's one of the few times that like my parasympathetic system would kick on. So that's a good tip too, right? And sometimes that can really help, especially if you're maybe still a little dysregulated and you're also having justified emotional upset. Maybe burning through the energy of that emotional upset will be more helpful than trying to automatically calm yourself down. You know what I mean? I think emotional processing and nervous system regulation in like neurodivergent worlds tend to be very similar to each other. It tends to involve this like exercises to kick in our rest and digest system more often. That tends to be the bigger piece that people are really focused on a lot with that, you know, and in mental health circles, like emotional processing can be that. But emotional processing or emotional regulation can also include, if you're seeking mental health treatment for yourself with like a really good mental health, you know, practitioner, that emotional regulation can also involve that top-down processing of like thinking of, you know, your sense of identity and who you are in the world and your worldview and perspectives on stuff like that. It can also involve that when it comes to emotional regulation, which that stuff is honestly best done, I think, in a one-on-one basis or maybe in a support group basis, but you want to do it with somebody who really knows how to help with that. But a lot of really good, effective mental health practitioners these days do a combination of both. They do like this body regulation, calming the system a bit, calming your nervous system, in addition to that top-down processing. They'll usually combine them. So like somatic techniques, you'll see that a lot. Somatic techniques tend to be this like bottom-up regulation, this like we're going to get the parasympathetic system more active, and then we can start talking about more upsetting emotions and processing through our thoughts about that, right? Or whatever, or what thoughts bring up those feelings, right? This all kind of interrelates, even though there's so much out there. And honestly, before having trauma-informed treatment, I didn't realize how much of these things were essentially the same things, just called something different. Honestly, this is basically converging research from different fields. That's essentially why some things get called different things, because different people are researching it and finding evidence that all kind of leads to the same point. Like it's all going to the, you know, down the Yellow Brick Road to the Emerald City or whatever. A little Wizard of Oz / Wicked, you know, reference. It's all heading that direction. But because it comes from different fields, people label it differently at first, you know. That happens a lot with modern research these days. So hopefully this helps to clarify. Once again, let me know if there's anything you want me to clarify in the comments below or go deeper on. The next couple of videos I have for our neurodivergent, like welcome to your late diagnosis, are energy meters and how we can use that to kind of judge how exhausted we're getting essentially throughout the day, which is really great to use with your sensory profile, which is the first video I did, which you can look at. And if that one's a little unclear, I could redo it. So let me know if there's a little too much confusion in that one. And I'll link it. The little thingy will pop up for whichever direction. Does it there? Is it here? I think it's over here. I don't know. Anyway, click on that, take a look, and let me know in those comments if there's anything that I need to clarify or redo. So we're going to do one on energy meters, and then I'm going to do one on executive functions, executive skills, like our brain, executive skills in our brain, just to go over what they are and like how you can kind of think through those in terms of your own personal strengths and weaknesses, because everybody has strengths and weaknesses in executive skills because it's all relative to yourself and what you can do. Some things are going to be easier than others. And a lot of us neurodivergents we know all too well about our weaknesses, but we never really understand what our strengths are. So I think it's good to just be aware of what skills, what they mean, and what you might you might be surprised. Your strengths might be things that are advanced to other people. And then the basic ones are the ones you struggle with, like quote unquote basic, right? Like it's very possible. So that's what's coming up. I hope you guys have a great week or two. Go ahead and try to get that rest and digest going as much as you can. And as Gen Zs say, like go outside and touch some grass if social media is getting a little much. And also if political news is getting a little much right now, if government of all the news of what's going on in the world, take a break. Take a break. Get more connected to your rest and digest system and just like, we're all just individuals. And so we only have so much ability and so much capacity to deal with so many things at once. And with all that said, I like to sign off by using reclaiming weirdo and saying that I think if we all just use our weird powers for good as a way to connect with each other and have a little more compassion for each other, that would be a real improvement to like the world. So in that spirit of building community and being compassionate with each other and with ourselves, I wish for you all to keep it weird. And until next time, guys, bye.